Welcome, everyone. I am here with two of my friends, and we wanted to talk about when self-compassion might be a good idea to reach for that. So if we haven't met, my name is Meekrit. I'm a registered dietitian, diabetes care and education specialist. I'm the author of No Weight Loss Required. My two friends are Elizabeth Watkins Price. I'm just going to make sure that I get everything right, but she is the author of Good Enough Mindfulness, which is a Substack publication, which really talks about mindfulness as a way to get to body liberation. So right up my alley. But Elizabeth also does a few other things, and those include she's a consultant and she's also a mindfulness teacher and, believe it or not, also a civil rights lawyer. And then also joining us is Valerie Spain. And Valerie is a mindfulness coach and a leadership coach, mindfulness teacher, mentor, and also another author. And she writes a wonderful Substack publication called The Glorious Ordinary. So in my conversation with both of them, I'm going to open it back up. I'm really curious about when it's appropriate to reach for self-compassion. We all know that diet culture is really good at blaming the individual. That blame can become internalized where we actually start believing it. This is really my question. How do we, why would we, what is it about self-compassion when somebody's trying to seek that body liberation, somebody's trying to move away from diabetes or weight, stigma, shame, internalization? How would we even know that self-compassion is actually the remedy? And Elizabeth, I'm really curious kind of if we could start with you, if I can turn it over to you and let me know your thoughts.
Sure. The short answer for me is that compassion, self-compassion in particular, is really appropriate all the time. So I think that mindfulness is a way to fully inhabit the life that we're already living. And for many of us, I think that compassion is how we open the door for mindfulness to arrive. And so I was pausing there because I was like, we need to define some things just so that we're all talking about these ideas from the same starting point. And the way that I define mindfulness is kind attention for the present moment experience. So that can sound so simple that it's like kind of hard to imagine it. And really in a lot of ways, what happens in a mindfulness class or in my Substack week after week, the things that I teach about are all these things that get in the way of this ability to be in kind attention for what's happening. So care is one of the things that I talk about a lot as like how we begin to engage with that. So just, and when I'm talking about care, I'm not talking about necessarily, though it can be like big loving attention. You know, it doesn't have to be like flowery and over the top. It can just be like a little warmth, you know, like care doesn't have to be big. It can be really small. And when we point care of whatever size in the direction of pain, that's what I call compassion. And so when we see these different terms, it may already intuitively jump out as to kind of how they fit together. But I was thinking I would share this story from a retreat that I went on a few years ago with Sylvia Borstein, who is a great teacher on the West Coast. And she says the answer to all questions in mindfulness is compassion, which I love. And so, you know, she was telling this story where she was talking about this classic image in mindfulness of the two wings of mindfulness. So like if mindfulness is a bird and it has two wings, one of those is wisdom or seeing clearly what's happening here in the present. So that's like that present moment awareness. And the other is compassion. And so compassion is really like naming the fact that there is stress in the human experience. And so there's always pain for us to point this care, this like modicum of care at. And so we've got the two wings. And then Sylvia talked about the body of the bird of mindfulness as courage, because it can really feel easier to stay checked out. And so the courage to come and engage fully with life and with the world that we have in these bodies, that we have in these aging, impermanent bodies, you know, so in this way, heart practices like self-compassion are synonymous with mindfulness because it's so natural that diet culture and achievement culture. And so many of these dominant systems have trained us towards self-criticism and self-judgment and reinforcing this hierarchy of bodies that makes us uncertain perhaps about or extremely certain of where we fall in a hierarchy of acceptance or acceptability. And so when we are in these systems that create a lot of discord and a lot of pain, compassion is kind of the only way I know how to get towards that kind of tension. We have to add this care because this is really difficult stuff. And so yeah, that's why I think that compassion is kind of always the answer.
I think you painted such a great picture because we know in diabetes stigma is gigantic. And that stigma also includes to people that are trying to prevent diabetes. So they've been told maybe that they're at risk and they're trying to prevent diabetes, and that stigma is really present. Like if you had just done X or if you were only Y, this condition wouldn't be present. And we can really see how that's an invitation to reach for self-compassion. You talked about the hierarchy of bodies, which I think is so beautiful to really recognize hierarchy is actually the antithesis of self-compassion because it's judgment. So we're leaning into this body is not as good as that body, and that in fact is judgment. And it's hard. It's hard for us to let go of judgment, and it does take a lot of courage because it's so dang familiar. So I love how you preface that. And just a funny aside, I was introduced to Sylvia Bornstein. I always think of her as like what got me more interested in meditation and actually in Buddhism. And I had just had my first child and I was suffering from postpartum depression. And my mother, who was very Christian at the time, said, I think you should read this book. And it's Sylvia Bornstein's The Buddhist Guide to Happiness. It's easier than you think. And I have probably purchased and given that book away. If I've done it once, I've done it 25 times. It really is just a primer, and it's these one-page little things. So just so much heart space for what a great teacher. And I'm so glad that you brought her forward. Anything else you'd like to add? And I'm very curious what Valerie has to say as well. But anything else, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll just add one more note because I think as you sort of helps to further define this idea of the hierarchy of bodies and how that creates this conflict, it was just reminding me this is why when I'm teaching mindfulness specifically towards body liberation or towards body compassion, sometimes that's a stepping stone on that path. I teach what I call compassion first mindfulness because I think that the programming, the self-talk of criticism is so ingrained, so deeply ingrained that when we begin with the invitation to come into awareness, many of us are coming with such strong automatic criticism and harshness that by naming and inviting compassion to come in the door first, it's why I think of it as like the thing that opens the door to being able to be with this experience. So yeah, thank you.
Valerie, you have a lot of experience both in your personal practice as somebody living with diabetes, but also in your mindfulness practice. So please kind of talk me through your thoughts about when it's appropriate to reach for that self-compassion.
Well, I agree with Elizabeth. I think it's all the time. I don't think we're ever, just in this culture, my experience hearing other people talk, it seems like we're the noise in our mind, the thoughts are just, even if you're not necessarily hearing them, there's often just sort of this little background thrumming of, you're not this, you don't do that, da, 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 a lot of negative self-talk. So I have had type 1 diabetes for like over 30 years now. And so I think my approach to this has been sort of very personal and then coming to the more teaching and sharing and coaching. So I was diagnosed with type 1 in the early 90s, but I was also in recovery from bulimia. So I had had an eating disorder for a number of years. And I really credit, and I was introduced to meditation when I was dealing with that eating disorder. And mindfulness really was one major key piece for me to deal with what was going on for me because there was so much negative self-talk. I mean, just quieting my mind was a huge piece of the work. It wasn't the only piece. There's a lot more that went into my healthcare providers, my own ability to stay with taking care of myself. But I do think, but mindfulness and the compassion that it kept showing me, the self-compassion that it sort of kept encouraging me to bring to the care, my self-care, just was so important. And I was dealing with a number of things. I was always also in an abusive marriage at the time. So there are a lot of things pushing me to, not care, not pay attention. And I don't know, sometimes I've thought often, I've gone back and thought about what is it that allowed me to persist with meditation. And when I think about it, it wasn't like it was an immediate, oh, I'm meditating every day. It was just, sometimes it was just like a little thread, like a hair, a thread really just hanging on by my toenails there. But there was enough persistence to stay with it. And I think with folks, for my experience as a person with type 1 is, because it tends to happen acutely, and nobody's saying, oh, if you'd done this, you wouldn't have gotten that. But once you have it, there's often a real push to, your numbers, look at your numbers. Everything has to be perfect. And it really can make you just be constantly looking at numbers and constantly, I mean, even if your numbers are quote good, even if there's one little flaw, like one day you had a few high numbers or something, suddenly, you don't want to show that to your endocrinologist, you don't want them to know that you had that one day. So bringing compassion to that self-care, that has been a huge part of my work, my own self-care, and also to be more open with self-care. So I have 2 sons, and when they were younger, I just took care of it. I didn't talk to people, I talked to my doctor, but I just took care of it. And there's a story that I often think about when my oldest son was a teenager. We were at the mall, back and forth. He was looking for this thing and back. And finally I said to him, are you going to drag your poor diabetic mother across the mall again? And that was so funny because I never used that word diabetic. And I hardly ever referenced my diabetes. And he said, Mom, I never think of you as having diabetes. And at the time, I was very proud of myself for having kept it all within. And self-compassion and really caring about recognizing that my self-care is not something to hide, but that it's something to be aware and open about, that it just began to sort of put chinks in that wall of, like I'm perfect, like I'm taking care of it all the time. You don't have to worry about me. I don't need any help. I feel like that self-compassion also opens the door to asking for help, being vulnerable about needing help, taking time to take care of oneself. And I also agree that it doesn't need to be a huge thing. If you can just get yourself to care, even just for a little bit, even a breath, take a breath, take a pause, give yourself a little space. That in itself is a kind of physical manifestation, a somatic, I guess, manifestation of self-compassion. So, yeah. And I do talk a lot about self-compassion as well with my leadership, with my coaching clients, et cetera. But I think really in this area of body and diabetes and the incredible pressure that people with all forms of feel to be self-managed at a high level without any kind of other support, for your mental health or for what's going on for you, like the social determinants of health, how do you have enough food? Can you get to a food store? What's your transportation situation? What's your family situation? All these are so important. And it's kind of not seen so much.
Yeah. You brought up a lot of points. So I want to pull a couple back. So the first one you talked about was perfectionism. And the second one you talked about was support, including our environmental supports. So the social determinants of health. You're pointing to 2 places that diet culture presents itself. These expectations, unrealistic expectations, and the isolation of diet culture that we withdraw and that by being perfect, it somehow makes us less vulnerable. But in fact, it makes us more vulnerable. The threads that are supporting us have actually been eroded. So our self-support is pulling away. And so we're literally left alone, where what would make a more stable base is to have that support. So you've really done a beautiful job of allowing me to ask Elizabeth, kind of, can you speak specifically to these ideas of self-compassion as a support? And also, if you could maybe think about expanding a little bit more into what are ways that mindfulness can support us? What are ways that self-compassion and reaching for self-compassion can support us?
Oh, I love that. Thank you for the question. Speaking to this idea coming from how do we step out of the perfectionism, the entire title of my Substack is Good Enough Mindfulness, because I think that just like in diet culture, like these are habits of mind that become so, we carry them across these different arenas. And so we can apply it to things like mindfulness, and people will come into a mindfulness practice being like very serious. And either I am meditating every day or it doesn't count. Either I'm figuring out how to meditate without guidance, from the beginning, or it doesn't count. And I love to help soften that some, because we have to start where we are. And when I meditate with a guided practice versus when I meditate in full silence, it is all meditation in the same way that self-compassion is another form of mindfulness. And I'm going to slow down and do definitions here one more time, because mindfulness is this quality of kind attention in the present moment. And meditation is the practice. And I know y'all know this, but just in case some listeners don't, meditation is the practice of being with the moment in a certain context that might make it more likely for mindfulness to kind of gather. And so people come into a meditation practice with that same sort of rigor and rigidity. And when we can soften off of that and take ourselves seriously for the efforts, even when they are small, it can be transformative. So I offer this little starter pack where I just have these 3 1-minute meditation recordings, because I think that 3 minutes a day can be a remarkable and transformative kind of starting point. If you were to check in with your intention in the morning and to check in with some awareness of what's happening midday and check in with some gratitude and noticing at the end of the day, it can get really concrete as you begin to shift towards this more caring attitude in the tiniest doses, and yet really see some big impact.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, Elizabeth, one of the things I talked about, so I formed the Center for Mindful Eating, and it's now closed, but for the 19 years that it was around, I used to say we can use food as the prompt to remind us to pause. And so again, before I eat, after I eat, I can use that as my little prompt to say, oh, this is a good opportunity to check in. So I love that. And again, Valerie, you had mentioned a little bit about that somatic work. Checking in. Am I hungry? Am I full? What would taste good? What would feel good in my body? Again, that's a mindfulness practice. You are, with compassionate curiosity, asking yourself what is present versus telling ourselves what we should do or what we can't do or what we're not allowed to do. So again, this mindful eating, which is mindfulness when eating or when engaging in any aspect of food or food preparation, it's a little place, a bite, as we like to say, where we can practice that mindfulness. And I love the 1-minute approach to meditation. I think that's beautiful. So thank you for that additional clarification. Valerie, anything you'd like to add? Because I know Elizabeth offered some definitions and a little bit more, and I'm very curious about your thoughts as well.
I'd just like to add that the word practice, I like to really emphasize practice. When Elizabeth was talking about people come, I did the same thing. You come and you're like, you're going to really do it, you're going to do the meditation, but it's practice. That's why it's called a practice, because if you're developing anything, you just practice it, right? You just come to it with an open heart and open mind. And that I think I emphasize that a lot with my clients, et cetera, that this is a practice. It's, we can't ignore that we come to even something like meditation and mindfulness with the culture's thoughts of getting somewhere, doing something, accomplishing, meeting a goal. So to be aware of those, set them aside as much as possible, and then just practice, give yourself some space to just practice what it's like to breathe for a minute. You're not asking yourself for a whole lot. You just want to be there for that. Just be there for that moment.
Yeah, that compassionately returning. So when I think about compassion, it's a compassionate curiosity. And again, compassionate curiosity helps us break the force of familiar, that pull to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Compassionate curiosity helps us. But when I drill down, people are like, well, what's self-compassion, Margaret? And so this conversation has given a lot more breadth to what self-compassion is. Elizabeth, you started with that beautiful, wisdom and self-compassion and courage in the center. We also talked about practice. We also talked about making it small, lowering expectations, not being perfect. I think there's a lot more we can add around self-compassion, when to reach for it. Valerie, you identified the supports. We reach for it to give ourselves support to continue, just to take that next step, to do the next thing, to allow ourselves that permission to be human. I'm wondering, and I'm going to open it up to both of you, if there's anything else around self-compassion, when we would want to reach for self-compassion. And I teach my clients around Kristen Neff's work, and she says when we're self-critical is a good time to reach for self-compassion. When we're feeling alone and isolated, also an excellent opportunity to reach for self-compassion. And we tell ourselves a story that it's this one thing. If I just did this one thing, if it wasn't for this one thing, that's a really good time to reach for self-compassion. But kind of any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, this might be too general, but we almost all know the tone of a negative thought. To notice that tone of negativity, begin to just pay attention. When is something, telling you something's wrong, or you should, identifying those words, you should have done, you could have done, et cetera, you didn't do, et cetera. So I think can you notice the tone in how you're talking to
the
yourself?
vibe.
Yeah. Would you talk to a friend that way? Right.
Yeah. I like thinking about like the vibe or the somatic. What's my somatic experience? Yes. How does this feel in my body? The tone, is my armor up? I remember I get supervision. I got supervision for 30 some odd years. And I remember my supervisor, Tina Fellis, said, Meegrid, do you remember when you ever have the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? And I go, yeah. She goes, always listen to that. Always listen to that. So that somatic experience where we're turning around and we're saying, we're drilling down, where is that landing? Where is that self-critical voice landing in our body? Elizabeth, you're nodding beautifully, so I'm going to pass it over to you and kind of ask for your additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the way that I was sort of imagining it as I was nodding enthusiastically was like, there's like the pushing factors towards self-compassion, like when we are experiencing weight stigma, when we are experiencing discomfort, disorder, displeasure, these are great reminders. And then there's also like the pulling factors, which is like when we notice the desire to feel better, it can also bring us right back here to like, okay, I want this thing. I want to turn towards myself. How do I turn? And being allowed to not know the answer to how to begin to care. So those were the things I was thinking as you were describing that so beautifully.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite things, not knowing I get to. Mm-hmm. So again, what we're doing when we give ourselves permission, and that's compassion, that's a practice of compassion. It's us reclaiming, I get to not know. I get to have doubt. I get to be uncertain. I get to act compassionately. I get to treat myself like I would a friend. I get to. It's really such a powerful thought. And we don't realize how much compassion and wisdom and courage is behind that. I get to learn. I get to change. I get to care for myself. I get to. So super powerful.
Yeah. I get to
So
be.
I get to be human. Oh my goodness. Who would ever think that was possible? Yay. I would like to, Valerie, starting with you, just give the listeners a little plug for Glorious Ordinary. So your Substack.
Yeah, thank you. So Glorious Ordinary really is an examination of who do you, how you mindfulness just manifests in ordinary life. It's ordinary through the lens of my life experiences, often using those as ways to really think about where does mindfulness show up in there? How do I bring mindfulness to that situation? Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, but it's a reflection on something that has happened, and an honest reflection, and hopefully a vulnerable one, about what it's like to try to navigate life with a mindfulness lens, or with a
Yeah.
mindfulness practice, I guess I should say.
Yeah, beautiful. When I read your work, I'm always reminded of it's that living out loud. And there's so much courage and so much acceptance in that reflection. So we talked throughout this interview about the threads and how can just be this tiny little thread. And I think you do such a beautiful job of helping the reader really reach in, not only to compassion, but also to find those threads that allow us to pull towards compassion. Very well done. Elizabeth, tell us about your amazing Substack, which I remember seeing it in my little feed. I said, this is my girl. She said, Good Enough Mindfulness. I think I reached out instantly.
Well, it's all about compassion for the mind and body we have now. So it is a combination of essays where I sort of am occupying the teacher seat and explaining how some of these concepts work. And then also some more reflective ones about what it looks like in practice. And in the first couple of years that I was doing my business for myself, I held every Wednesday meditation group for fat activists. And as that group sort of had reached the end of its season, I ended up adding that to my Substack. So I offer a free meditation recording each week because it was a little easier to keep that in an asynchronous format than to continue holding noon on Wednesday in perpetuity. So it has a recording each week and an opportunity to practice and hopefully something to learn about or consider as well.
Yeah. And I love that about your Substack, which is it's really getting into, like you said, the teacher mode. And it was described multiple times about really getting the supports that we need in order for us to have a practice. And so here you have done such a beautiful job of offering this, free resource where we can really start understanding the value of self-compassion, the value of being in the body we have. Like amazing. Chef's kiss. Mwah, love it. So awesome. It was super fun being with you guys and learning more about how you identify when to reach for self-compassion. And again, I thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for hosting and for this lovely conversation.
Yeah, very much. Thank you.